Okay, so just a little background, to the book. The Maharal, in general, what he mainly does in his books, he tries to explain. Shalom. He generally tries to explain, the words of Chazal, especially the Midrashim, and mainly also the different Agadot that appear in the Talmud. That's in general what he does. That's the main focus of most of his books. And interestingly, actually, regarding Megilat Esther, we have like about 5 or 6 pages in Masechet Megilah, that both have like general Midrashim on the Megilah, but also it seems like the Gemara there is going, throughout a good deal of the Megilah and interpreting it, different words of the Chazal and the Moraim, just interpreting psukim of the Megilah. So what the Maharal does in his book Or Chadash is most of it is a running commentary on Megilat Esther. In other words, he really goes pasuk after pasuk, but not just explaining the psukim, but primarily explaining, the words of Chazal and how Chazal explain the psukim and the deeper meaning of it all. But he also deals with the psukim themselves and also the words of Chazal. So it's really a fascinating and very deep perush on the Megillah. I never really, read it in order. I just sort of each year read bits and pieces and jump around a little bit. So I thought it might be nice to try to, I don't know how much we're going to be able to cover, but to try to just read them together in order. And in his, he starts off with his Akdama, which he deals with some general, very famous ideas in the Gemara on the Megillah and on Purim. And so we'll start with that. Okay, so if you downloaded it from Hebrew Books, it's on page 42 in the PDF file. That's where he really starts the book, Hakdama. So he starts off with the introduction. So I'm just going to read through and try to explain. And if anybody has, any comments or questions or insights or whatever, feel free. It's just more us learning together or trying to learn out together and see what we can get out from the Maharal. So he says as follows: Or Chadash, Perush al Megilat Esther. In other words, he's calling here the name of his book Or Chadash, a new light, and a commentary on Megilat Esther. V'nikra b'shem hazeh. So he's starting off to explain why he called his book Or Chadash, his commentary Or Chadash. And he says, כי דאמרינן בפרק כמה במגילה, ליהודים הייתה אורה, אמר רבי אליעזר, אמר רב יהודה, אורה זו תורה, שנאמר, כי נר מצווה ותורה אור. Okay, so this is one of the most famous things on Gemara and Purim is that it says, ליהודים הייתה אורה, שמחה וששון ועיקר. So the Gemara says, אורה זו תורה, שמחה זה יום טוב, ששון זו מילה, ועיקר אלו תפילין. Okay, so the Maharal is not, he's going to, I think we'll see, he's going to address some of the issues, but he starts off primarily addressing, when Chazal said, ליהודים הייתה אורה זו תורה, it sounds like that was something new that the Yehudim had there. ליהודים הייתה אורה, in other words, after the whole miracle of Purim, then ליהודים הייתה אורה, now they had Torah. So he asks on this, and Orah is Torah based on the pasuk in Mishlei Ki ner mitzvah v'Torah Or, that we see that the Torah is called Or, light. Okay, you see already that's how it's going to connect to the name that he called his Perush, Or Chadash. ויש לשאול, הרי כבר היה להם התורה מסיני. They already had Torah. Torah was given a good number of years earlier at Matan Torah, at Har Sinai. So what does it mean, ליהודים הייתה אורה? Now they had Torah. They've had Torah for quite a while now. בישלמה מה שאמר וששון זו המילה וכן יקר זו התפילין. Right, the other ones, that Sasson is Milah and Yikar Zet Tefillin. You could also ask the same question. They've had those mitzvot of Brit Milah and Tefillin also since at least Har Sinai, if not earlier. He says, דבר זה יתברר בסמוך, כי בשביל וכולי מצוות המילה ובשביל מצוות תפילין, היו גוברים על המן. In other words, he says that we can understand because when it says ליהודים הייתה ששון, מילה ויקר זה תפילין, what it means is not that they didn't have these mitzvot beforehand, but rather that these mitzvot, that's what gave them the power to overpower Haman. The zchut of the mitzvah tefillin, mitzvah milah, that's what gave them the power to overcome Haman. אבל ליהודים הייתה אורה, זו תורה, נראה שאין לפרש בשביל התורה היו גוברים על המן. כי זה אין צריך לומר. כי כל זכות מה שיש לישראל, הכל הוא התורה. לכך לא היה צריך לכתוב זה. In other words, he says, but we can't say the same explanation that bizchut, the Torah, that's how they overcame Haman. You can say that regarding Milah and Tfilin, that bizchut Milah and bizchut Tfilin, that's why they overcame Haman. But you can't say that bizchut the Torah, they overcame Haman. Because he says that's what the Jewish people are about. Israel is, without Torah, there is no Israel to speak of. So that's not specific enough. It's like stating the obvious. Of course, anything that's happened to Am Yisrael is b'zchut Torah. Without the Torah, there's nothing, there's no Am Yisrael to speak of. So he says, Ki kol zchut ma sheish Yisrael hakol haTorah, לכך לא היה צריך לכתוב זה. Right? So it can't be that b'zchut Torah they overcame Haman. What does that mean? That doesn't tell you anything. If you say b'zchut milah, b'zchut tefillin, okay, so we say, this specific mitzvah, that's what helped them overcome Haman. But to say b'zchut Torah, they overcame Haman, b'zchut Torah, that's what Am Yisrael is about, the Torah. Without the Torah, there's nothing to speak of. This reminds me, I was once at a conference of rabbis, and a very important rabbi spoke at the conference, and he was trying to give a message, and he said, we have a lot of problems in the Jewish world, the education and intermarriage, whatever. And he said, what's the way that we can overcome all these problems? So he said, the answer is the Torah. That's how we'll overcome it. Okay, and I was thinking to myself, what has he said? He hasn't said anything. He's speaking to a conference of rabbis. Of course, it's b'zchut Torah. That's what everybody's here for. But if you have to say something a little more specific. You're dealing with these problems. Don't just say b'zchut Torah. Obviously, everybody agrees on that. You're not trying. If you were speaking maybe to non-rabbi, what?
In English, Rabbi, you'd call that a sine qua non.
A what?
A sine qua non is in Latin. It goes without saying.
Yeah, it's pshita.
It goes without saying.
You have to say something a little more specific. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can't just say, "Oh, Torah," right? That's why we overcame Haman. That's what the Maharal is asking. So what does it mean? What did Chazal mean when they said "La Yudim Hayta Ora Zot Torah"? Okay. So he says the explanation is different. Okay. He says, "אבל מה שאמר אורה זו תורה, כדאמרינן במסכת שבת בפרק רבי עקיבא, והתייצבו בתחתית ההר, מלמד שכפה עליהם הר כגיגית. ואמר להם, אם אתם מקבלים התורה מוטב, ואם לאו שם תהיה קבורתכם." Right, very famous Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, that at Matan Torah, basically Hashem took Har Sinai and overturned the mountain on them and told them, either you accept the Torah or you will all be buried here. Okay? In other words, that Hashem really coerced them to accept the Torah. They had no choice. It was either to accept the Torah or to die. Okay? And then the Gemara says, based on that, Amar Ba'achar Bar Yaakov, Mikan Moda Rabba Leoraita. Moda is a concept that we have in Halakha. We have it, let's say, by a husband who's giving a get, or somebody who's, let's say, selling a piece of land. So if he's being forced into doing it, and he's not really interested in selling the land or to give the get, right? So what he can do is say a moda'ah beforehand. In other words, he tells two witnesses before he's doing the act, know that I'm only doing this because I'm coerced and I'm not really interested in doing it. Okay, so let's say he's being forced into sell a piece of land, so he goes out beforehand and he tells to Edim, moda'ah, I'm only selling this land because I'm being forced into it, and that moda'ah will cancel the sale. Or for example, by a get, he can say beforehand, I'm being forced into giving this get, I'm not interested, and that will cancel the get. That's why in the get, anytime we do a get, we have a whole process that we do bitul modot, that in the case that he previously gave a modah, that he'll cancel that modah. So based on this, the Gemara says, Mikan modah rabba loraita. Now the Jewish people have a moda'ah on the observance of the Torah. Why? Because we didn't have a choice. We were coerced into accepting the Torah. So therefore, we can't we can't be punished for seemingly we can't be punished for not observing the Torah because we were forced into accepting it. Amar Rava, אף על פי כן הדור קיבלוה בימי אחשוורוש, שנאמר קיימו וקיימו, קיימו וקיבלו, קיימו מה שקיבלו כבר. עד כאן. והרי חזרו ישראל וקיבלו התורה. ואם לאו, הרי יש מודעה רבה לאורייתא, וצריכו לחזור ולקבלה. In other words, so Rava said, when did the Jewish people willfully accept the Torah? That only happened בימי אחשוורוש. In other words, when it says Kimu v'kiblu hayudim aleihem, right, even though the simple reading of the verse is referring just to that they accepted the Chag Purim and the mitzvot of the Chag Purim, whatever Mordechai and Esther instituted, nevertheless, Rav is explaining that they re-accepted the Torah, okay? And that's what it means when it says, Layudim hayta orah, that now they really had the Torah. They didn't have it earlier, even though they had the Torah, but until the Yemei Achashverosh, they had an excuse not to keep it. That they said we were coerced into accepting it. But B'Yemei Achashverosh, now they accepted the Torah willfully, and from this point on, there is no moda. Okay, fine. So that's what it means, Layudim hayta orah. Okay, now we have the obvious question. And this is a question that already Tosfot asks there on Masechet Shabbat. והתוספות יקשו שם, והלא כבר הקדימו נעשה לנשמע. Right, very famous. How can you say that the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, were coerced into accepting the Torah? Right, they said na'aseh v'nishma. Right, that's the biggest chut that we have, that at Matan Torah we said na'aseh v'nishma, and we accepted the Torah. So what is the Gemara talking about? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu kafar lehem har kigigit, that he forced them into accepting the Torah. ותרצו התוספות, בשמא היו חוזרים בהם שראו האש הגדולה. In other words, Tosfot is saying, even originally what happened was they accepted, they said na'aseh v'nishma, right? But then there was the whole thing that they saw the revelation of Hashem and they saw the big fire, right? And then if you remember, it says in Sefer Dvarim that then they asked Moshe Rabbeinu that he will speak to them instead of a Torah. In other words, they became very afraid of the Esh HaGdolah, of the direct revelation that they have of Hashem. So then they retracted their Kabbalah of Na'aseh v'nishma, and once they retracted, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to coerce them in kafar lehem har kigigit. Okay, that's the answer of Tosfot. Seems a bit strange. We'll see how the Maharal deals with it. Okay. In other words, they accepted, then they retracted because of the Esh HaGdolah, and then then the Kadosh Baruch Hu had to force them into it. Okay. Now Tosfot has another problem with this Gemara. Why? Because it says, "V'hada amar beperek kama de'avodah zara, klum kafita aleinu har kegigit, mashma אם היה כופה עליהם הר גיגית, לא היה להם תשובה. והכה אמר דמודה רבה לא ראית שהיו חוזרים בהם. In other words, in Avodah Zarah, there the Gemara seems to say it as a question. Did you force us to accept the Torah? Did you place a mountain over us to force us to accept the Torah? Mashma that didn't happen. So we have a contradiction. In the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was kofeh har kigigit, that he forced them into accepting the Torah. In the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, it's mashma that the Gemara was asking it as a rhetorical question. Were you kofeh aleinu har kigigit? Mashma that it didn't happen. Okay, so how do we resolve that? היינו על שלא קיבלוה, אבל מה שלא קיימו, איכא תשובה עד כאן. דברי התוספות. Okay, in other words, so Tosfot says, really, it sounds from Tosfot as follows. Okay, I'm not so clear again what exactly Tosfot is saying, but it sounds from Tosfot as follows: that they originally accepted the Torah, right? So that was on the Kabbalah. So regarding that, there was an original acceptance of the Torah, and that they weren't forced on, and that there was no kfiyah har kigigit on, and that's the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah. However, afterwards they retracted, right, because of the Esh HaGdolah, and then they were coerced. So on the Kabbalah Torah, the original acceptance, that they weren't coerced into. So for that, they can't come and complain, you coerced us kfiyat har kigigit. However, what ultimately later on they didn't, if they would not fulfill the Torah later on, for that they would have an excuse that they were forced into it. Why? Because they said we wanted to take back our retraction, our acceptance, once we saw the Esh HaGdolah, and then we were coerced into keeping the Torah onwards, to keep, to preserve the acceptance of the Torah, that we were coerced into, and now they would have an excuse if they would not fulfill the Torah. Okay, very strange, the whole mahalach here of Tosfot. They accepted, then they retracted, and then they were forced into it, and then in Purim they reaccepted. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, so let's see what the Maharal says on this. So the Maharal says, he says, "ובאמת התירוץ הוא קשה מאוד." The answer of Tosfot is very difficult. He says, כי מה שהקדימו ישראל נעשה ונשמע, הוא זכות הגדול של ישראל. Right? That's what we always speak about. Am Yisrael said נעשה ונשמע. That's our great זכות. You know, that we did that. ואיך נאמר שהיו חוזרים בהם ממה שאמרו נעשה ונשמע. According to Tosfot, what they did נעשה ונשמע seems to be meaningless, right? Because they retracted it. Okay, great, they said נעשה ונשמע, but immediately afterwards they retracted it. Okay, ושם אמרו, right, in that same Gemara in Masechet Shabbat says, נמשלו לישראל לתפוח. מה תפוח פריו קודם לאליו, אף ישראל הקדימו נעשה לנשמע. Right, most fruits, they sort of, you have the leaves and then the fruit comes out, but the apple is the reverse. First the fruit comes out and then the leaves. So in other words, it goes from the reverse order. And he says, the Gemara says that as a praise to Am Yisrael that they first said Naseh v'nishma. In other words, before they even heard what the mitzvot, they already said whatever it is, we're doing it. So it sounds like, you know, there's what to be praised for saying Naseh v'nishma. ולפירוש התוספות, הרי חוזרים בהם כשראו אש הגדולה. But according to Tosfot, they retracted from נעשה ונשמע. So what is the Midrash praising Am Yisrael for saying נעשה ונשמע if they retracted it? ועוד אמרו שם, בשעה שהקדימו ישראל נעשה להם ונשמע, באו קוף כף ריבו של מלאכי השרת, וקשרו לכל אחד שני כתרים, אחד כנגד נעשה ואחד כנגד נשמע. Right, we know there were, let's say, 600,000 people, you know, in Har Sinai. So at that time, 1,200,000 angels came, and 2 angels per person to give everybody 2 crowns, one for Naseh and one for Nishma, for all the people present at Har Sinai. So we see this tremendous praise and zchut for saying Naseh v'Nishma. ולפירוש התוספות, הרי היו חוזרים בהם, but according to Tosfot, again, they retracted it all. ועוד כי לפירוש התוספות משמע כי מה שכפה עליהם הר כגיגית הוא מודה רבה מה שלא קיימו ישראל לתורה. Right, also according to Tosfot, right, Tosfot said that even though they accepted willfully, since afterwards they retracted and they were coerced into keeping the Torah, now they have a modah. Right, anybody who doesn't fulfill the Torah, at least up until Yemei Achashverosh, can come and claim we have a modah, we were coerced into accepting the Torah. Right, so that's also very difficult. אם כן, יש לשאול, כי אף על גם שחזרו וקיבלו עליהם בימי מרדכי את התורה, even though in the times of Mordechai, then they really willfully accepted the Torah, מכל מקום, הדורות שהיו קודם שחזרו וקיבלו בימי מרדכי, איך נענשו על שלא קיימו התורה? So how all the generations, up till the days of Mordechai, how could they be punished for not fulfilling the Torah? And we know that they were punished, right? They were punished in the times of Yoshua, Shoftim, Melachim, you know, we had Galut Beit Rishon. All of that happened as punishments before the days of Mordechai. But according to what we said now, all those generations, they could come to Hashem. They say, all of this is not fair. We have a modah rabba lo'oraita, that we were coerced into accepting the Torah. Right? Vayesh modah rabba, v'adayin lo chazru v'kiblu et Torah. Okay, so what's going on here? In other words, the Chorah, based on Tosfot, all the generations up till the times of Mordechai, they all have an excuse for not fulfilling the Torah because of the Kfiyat al-Kididit. Okay, so what's the answer? So he says, "V'tzarich lomar leperush HaTosfot." So first the Maharal is going to try to explain the Tosfot, and we'll see he's going to go on his own path. So he says, "V'tzarich lomar leperush HaTosfot, ki hu yitbarach יודע הוא שלא היו חוזרים רק בשביל שראו את האש הגדול." In other words, even though they retracted, why did they retract? Because, again, Tosfot said, because of the revelation of the Esh HaGdolah. So he says Hashem knew that wasn't a real retracting. They weren't really retracting from Naseh v'Nishma. They were just frightened because of the Esh HaGdolah, the big fire. ודבר זה אינו חזרה. כי ישראל היו סבורים כי תמיד ידבר השם יתברך עמהם כך, ויהיה להם החזרה. אבל השם יתברך כי לא יהיה זה רק בפעם הזה. Right? In other words, why did they want to retract after seeing the Yesh HaGdolah? Because they thought it would always be like this. So they said, we can't handle this revelation. It's too powerful for us. So that's why they retracted. But they were only retracting, right? Because they thought that it will always be like this. But Hashem knew that it was just this once, just the revelation of Har Sinai was a revelation to everybody, that everybody had this very powerful revelation. Right? The solution was that Hashem wouldn't reveal himself directly to all of Am Yisrael. That was a one-time thing at Har Sinai. And from that point on, Moshe Rabbeinu would speak to them, or in later generations, other Nevi'im would stand between them and Hashem. So it's not really that they retracted. It was sort of a mistaken retraction. They retracted just because they assumed that, they would always have to face the Yesh HaGdolah. But really, they weren't really retracted. Okay? But nevertheless, there's still a modah because they could still come and claim, look, we retracted. Okay? Granted, we might have been retracting from the acceptance of the Torah under a mistaken assumption, but technically speaking, we retracted. So that's why there is a modah. But in other words, when they reaccepted the Torah in the times of the Chashverosh, it actually demonstrated retroactively that what they originally retracted wasn't a real retraction, that it was a mistaken retraction, because they thought that this would be a permanent situation, that Hashem would speak with them directly. But when they reaccepted the Torah in the Achashverosh, it wasn't like acceptance only from this point onwards, but rather it was saying, no, really, we always meant to accept the Torah like we originally said Naseh v'Nishma, and what we retracted in the interim, that was a mistake. That was just because we were mistaken. We thought that the Yesh HaGdolah would be a permanent situation.
Is he arguing, Rabbi, that the whole miracle of Purim was because they reaccepted the Torah at the time of Achashverosh, or what?
Well, he hasn't really explained why it happened in the Purim. Hopefully, he'll explain that later. Why Dafka in Purim they reaccepted the Torah.
Yeah, exactly. That's my question.
He's going to get into that. I assume he's going to get into that. But he's just saying at this point in time, he's just trying to explain sort of the logic of Tosfot. They accepted, then they retracted, and then they reaccepted. So how does that work? So he said, no, they accepted originally. Then because of the Yesh HaGdolah, the great revelation, it startled them. So that's why they retracted. But when they reaccepted in the times of Mordechai, we don't know why, Dafka, then they reaccepted, but that was an exception retroactive. In other words, they were, in essence, canceling their retraction. And that's why Lemafrea, there is no modah. Once they reaccepted in the time of Chazrosh, now retroactively, their original exceptions of Naseh v'Nishma is valid. And that's why all the generations, even before Mordechai, can be held accountable.
In a way, they're using this modah as a get out of jail free card.
Well, they could have used it, but Lamaisa, they forfeited it in the times of Mordechai. So now it doesn't apply anymore. It was in theory, but it wasn't really, they lost the card, in other words. Okay? רק בשביל שהיו סבורים כי ידבר השם יתברך עמהם תמיד ולא יוכלו להתקיים, כמו שאמרו. אם עושים אנחנו לשמוע את כל השם אלוקינו עוד. ואנחנו, in other words, because they thought they were going to die if this revelation was continued, ומה שחזרו וקיבלו עליהם התורה, אין זה רק גילוי מילתא שלא תוהו. In other words, it just sort of demonstrates that they never really meant to retract. It was all a mistake. Okay, so that's how he explains Tosfot. Again, he doesn't really explain what this has anything to do with Yemei Mordechai, whatever, but he's just saying that's sort of the mechanism. In other words, they accepted, according to Tosfot, retracted, but it was a mistaken retraction, and they re-demonstrated that the original acceptance was a willful acceptance in the times of Mordechai. Okay, now he's going to say a different explanation than Tosfot. He says, he says, really, no, they never retracted from the Naseh v'Nishma. Okay, so we're back to the question of Tosfot. Why did Hashem need to force them into accepting the Torah if they willfully accept it? In other words, it's strange. In other words, Hashem asked them, are you willing to accept the Torah? And they said, yes, of course. And then he puts a gun to their head and he says, you have to accept the Torah, you're going to die. Right? So what's going on here? So he says, דבר זה, מפני כי התורה שהיא לישראל, בא קיום העולם. In other words, without the Torah, without Am Yisrael accepting the Torah, the world doesn't have any existence. That's what the world is created for. וכמו שאמר, אם מקיימים את התורה מוטב, ואם לאו, החזיר את העולם לתוהו ובוהו. In other words, when Hashem said to them, you must accept the Torah, what did he say to them in essence? He said to them, either you accept the Torah, or the world will cease to exist. We'll cancel the creation. We'll go back to tohu vavohu, to the void that there was prior to creation. ואם כן, התורה הוא מחויב והכרחי. ומה בכך שהם קיבלו התורה והקדימו נעשה לנשמה? מכל מקום ניתנה לישראל התורה כמו שהיא בעצמה. In other words, he says, the Maharal said they willfully accepted the Torah, but that acceptance is meaningless. Why? Because they had no choice. The Torah is הכרחי. In other words, it must be. The Torah must be given. Without the Torah, there is no existence to the world. So therefore, even though they wanted to accept the Torah, that acceptance has no meaning. He says, מכל מקום ניתנה לישראל התורה, כמו שהיא בעצמה. וכיוון שהתורה בעצמה הכרחי, כך נתינת תורה לישראל בהכרח הגמור. שאם אין התורה, העולם חרב. In other words, since the Torah is a necessity for the existence, the world cannot exist without the Torah. So too, the giving of the Torah to Israel is echrach gamur. It must happen. They didn't really have a choice in the matter, because without the Torah, the world will be destroyed. It's like, for example, somebody will come to the tax office and say to them, I willfully accept upon myself to pay the taxes. Okay, they'll tell him, that's very nice, but it really doesn't matter if you accept yourself to pay the taxes or not. You have to anyway, right? So it's meaningless, the acceptance, right? It has no, it's nothing. So therefore, that's what the Maharal is saying. When Chazal said, Kafarim al Gigit, it wasn't because Am Yisrael weren't willing to accept, or because they were trying to retract, like Tosfot said. What Chazal mean by that, Kafarim al Gigit, is that they were, whether they wanted it or not, it had to happen. Okay? And he says, so what does the Gemara mean that they said that now there's a moda on the Torah, right? That now they could say, we were coerced into it. So he says, since the giving of the Torah was a must, there was no choice in the matter. דבר זה הוא מודע רבה לאורייתא, ואיך לא יהיה כפה עליהם הר כגיגית, כי יאמרו כי התורה אינה מוכרחת ומחויבת, רק שבאה התורה לעולם בשביל שרצו בישראל שהיו מקבלים אותה מדעתם, ואינו דבר מוכרח, ואין הדבר כך, כי התורה היא מחויבת בהכרח, ואם לא היה התורה, היה חוזר העולם לתוהו ובוהו, וכפי שהיה התורה בעצמה, כך הייתה קבלתה שהכריח אותם על זה. In other words, he's saying, so what the Gemara means, Moda Rabba Loraita, is that it's not dependent on Am Yisrael's acceptance. Whether Am Yisrael would have accepted it or not, they were forced into receiving the Torah. Because again, without Am Yisrael receiving the Torah, the world would cease to exist. Okay? And now he adds another layer of explanation. ועוד, בשביל כך היה כופה עליהם הר כגיגית, כדי שיהיו אנוסים, שהיה מאנס אותם על קבלת התורה, וכיוון שהיו ישראל אנוסים, ובמאנס כתיב לא יוכל לשלחה כל ימיו, וכן לא ייפרד ישראל מן השם יתברך לעולם. Very interesting. He says another value, or another idea behind the Torah being coerced upon Am Yisrael, is that in essence also binds Hashem to Am Yisrael. Why? So he says, we sort of have this idea, again, it's a bit of a strange comparison, but if somebody, we know the halakha, that if somebody rapes a na'ara betula, a virgin girl, right? So the halakha is that he has to marry her. Again, if she's willing to marry him, but in the olden times, most likely she would be willing to. It's a bit of a peculiar notion for us nowadays to think of it that way. But in the old days, a young girl that was raped right about the age of marriage, she basically, nobody would want to marry her, or it'd be very hard for her to find somebody who would be willing to marry her. So the Torah commands the ones, the rapist, to marry her, and he's prohibited from divorcing her all his life. Okay, so he says a similar idea here. Okay, if the giving of the Torah was sort of like an agreement, okay, Am Yisrael, Hashem offers them the Torah, Am Yisrael agree to it, and they come to some sort of agreement, then that agreement can be undone. Okay, Am Yisrael can break off the agreement, or Hashem can break off the agreement. However, because it was done honest, that Hashem coerced Am Yisrael into the agreement, so now Hashem is also responsible towards Am Yisrael. He can't retract from it either. So now Hashem is also bound to Am Yisrael forever. Okay. וכך אמרו במדרש. Okay, he says here in the parentheses that we don't exactly know where the Maharal found this midrash, but he says, וכך אמרו במדרש על הפסוק, ולא תהיה לאישה לא יוכל לשלחה כל ימיו, כשבא הקדוש ברוך הוא לתת תורה לישראל, כפה עליהם הר כגיגית, שיקבלו תורתו, וכיוון שכך הרי ישראל אנוסתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, ובאנוסה כתיב לא יוכל לשלחה כל מימיו. ואילו המפתה אין בה שלא יוכל לשלחה. Right? Somebody who seduces the girl, he doesn't have to marry her, and if he marries her, he's allowed to divorce her. The one who rapes the girl, he's bound to her for the rest of his life. He's not allowed to divorce her. Okay? So same thing, Kadosh Baruch Hu forced, he didn't offer or try to entice Am Yisrael to the course of the Torah. He coerced them into it, and therefore he's also cannot cast off Am Yisrael forever.
What about after Purim when we accepted it willingly? Does he still become Kadosh Baruch Hu still responsible forever once we accept it willingly?
We'll soon see. The Maharal explains, but according to the Maharal, even then we accepted it willfully. But it doesn't matter. He's saying it doesn't matter that we accepted it willfully because we didn't have a choice in the matter, right? That acceptance, even though they accepted willfully, it still doesn't matter because even it wasn't that they had a choice whether they could accept or not. They were coerced into it.
But after Purim?
We'll see what Purim means. He hasn't gone to that yet. He's just trying to explain first what does the Gemara mean by kafare mal kegigit. So he says it doesn't contradict Naaseh v'nishma in the sense that it was a coercion, even though they accepted, they were still coerced. Why they were coerced? Two reasons. First is because that was something that was necessary for the existence of the world. So there was no course of history without that happening. And secondly, because of also the nature of the commitment of Hashem towards us. Okay. And he says the difference between the mefateh, the one who seduces the girl, and the ones is as follows. V'atam, keivan shaya ma'anes ota, im ken hu haya machriach ota el hachibur. והחיבור שהוא הכרחי, אין לזה סילוק כלל, כיוון שהחיבור הכרחי. In other words, the nature of the ones is that since he uses coercion, then it cannot be undone. In other words, it's considered, it sort of goes back to the first idea that he said, the Torah is the chechit. It has to be. If something has to be, it's not a matter of choice. So if it has to be on both ends. It has to be on the part of Am Yisrael that it has no choice, but so to speak, also from the perspective of Hashem, it has to be. And Hashem also does not have a choice in the matter in the sense that it must be. This is a commitment forever. It cannot be ever undone. Okay, והפירוש אשר פירשנו הוא פירוש זה עצמו. ולא אמר במדרש בשביל שהיו הנושאים כפה עליהם. רק משהו מתחייב מזה שהכריח אותם על התורה, שמתחייב מזה שאין השם יתברך מפריד מאיתו ישראל. אבל עיקר הסיבה שהיה מכריח אותם הוא הטעם שאמרנו כי התורה בעולם היא יחסית. Okay? In other words, he says it wasn't that they were coerced into it, that they didn't go into it willfully, but rather Hashem coerced them into it in the sense that he cannot separate from us anymore, and also that it was a necessity and must be in the world. Okay, now he brings another answer to what does it mean, kafalem har kigigit and Naaseh v'nishma. A third answer. We had the first answer of Tosfot, the second answer of the Maharal. Now he's going to bring a third answer from the Midrash. And he says, ובמדרש תנחומא בפרשת נוח, מקשה קושייה זאת, למה הוצרך השם יתברך לכפות עליהם הר כגיגית? ולא כבר אמרו נעשה ונשמע. ופירוש שם כי לא קיבלו רק תורה שבכתב, ולא התורה שבעל פה. In other words, so another answer of the Midrash Tanchuma was that נעשה ונשמע applies to the Torah שבכתב, to the written Torah. The כפיית הר-כגיגית applies to the Torah שבעל פה, all the oral Torah and the halachot. Why? כי תורה שבעל פה יש בה דקדוקי מצוות שהם עזים וקשים. וכך כפה עליהם הר-כגיגית. In other words, the Torah שבכתב, it's simpler. Okay? לא תבשל גדי בחלב אמו, right? Don't cook a kid in its mother milk. Torah שבעל פה is now much more difficult. You have a lot more details, right? all of הלכות בשר בחלב. So for that they didn't accept willfully, for that there was coercion, כפיית הר-כגיגית. וגם לפירוש זה קשה, בסוף סוף לא היו רוצים בתורה שבעל פה, בתורה שבעל זה. והנה דעת נוחה בזה למעט זכות ישראל בתורה, אין התורה שבעל פה, אין תורה שבכתב. Right? So he says this midrash is also difficult because according to this midrash, Am Yisrael only wanted the Torah shebachtav and not the Torah sheba'al peh. So it also reduces the zchut of Am Yisrael in saying Naseh v'nishma. So this midrash also doesn't seem to make sense. So he says, ונראה כי אין הפירוש שלא היו רוצים לקבל עליהם תורה שבעל פה עד שכפה עליהם את ידידית. In other words, it says the midrash doesn't mean that they weren't willing to accept תורה שבעל פה. רק כי רצה לומר כי מה שכפה עליהם הר כגיגית הוא בשביל כי כך ראוי. כי התורה שבכתב היא ראשונה לקבלה, מכך קבלתה היא בלא כפייה. כי ישראל מצד עצמם הם ראויים ומוכנים לתורה על כל פנים. ואין שייך לכפות עליהם התורה כאשר הם מוכנים מצד עצמם אל התורה. אבל התורה שבעל פה אין קרובה כל כך קבלתה כמו התורה שבכתב, כי התורה שבכתב קודם לקבל ואחר כך תורה שבעל פה, וישראל מצד עצמם מוכנים לתורה, ובתורה שבכתב הרי יש להם תורה, וכך קבלתה של תורה שבעל פה שכפה עליהם הר כגיגית. אבל שלא יהיו ישראל רוצים בתורה שבעל פה והיה צריך לכפות עליהם ההר, ולמעט זכותם של ישראל דבר זה אינו. In other words, okay, we'll pick this up next time, but he's trying to answer that even the Midrash doesn't mean that Am Yisrael weren't willing to accept the Torah שבעל פה. He's saying that Torah שבכתב is more natural to them. They're more ready for the Torah שבכתב. So for that was a good acceptance. The Torah שבעל פה, it wasn't that they weren't willing to accept, but the Torah שבעל פה, it's not, they weren't so ready for it. It's not as easy, it's not, the acceptance is not as fluid, and that's why there was an element of coercion in the acceptance of Torah שבעל פה. Not that they were refusing the Torah שבעל פה, but because they weren't so ready for it, it's not like an easy fit. So regarding that, that's what the Midrash means, that there was a need of coercion regarding Torah שבעל פה. Okay, we'll stop here. Okay, but we'll try to pick up next time how all of this ultimately connects to Purim. Why in Purim, in Yemei Hashverosh, they
Are you going to do a continuation share?
Yeah, we'll try to do it. I'm not sure I can do it the same time next Sunday because I'm flying to London, but I'll let you know next Sunday which time. But in the following Sundays, hopefully we'll continue in around.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.